Peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon you, and welcome to all our dear followers everywhere. The Greatest Secret channel, under the supervision and management of the writer and author, Mr. Mohammad Salim Al-Kazimi, Al-Maqdisi, is pleased to welcome you to this renewed encounter and to announce the launch of the new and highly anticipated season of the legendary debate between the atheist and the Muslim. This season comes to unveil the most prominent intellectual issue of our time, which revolves around the dilemma of atheism in denying the unseen world.
From an audio article to the grand debate. This intellectual discourse began as an audio article in 3 international languages, Arabic, English, and German, authored by the channel's director, Mr. Mohammad Al-Kazimi. You can always access it via the link in the description box below this video on the Greatest Secret YouTube channel. Given the significant and remarkable interest this topic has garnered, and the exceptional engagement and numerous insightful comments and contributions we have received, especially from our German and English-speaking followers, the channel's management has decided to transform these discussions and scholarly responses into a visual and audio format. These responses have been structured as a legendary debate, spanning several episodes, totaling over 10 hours of philosophical and scientific research and analysis.
Why is it an exceptional debate? Contemporary and sensitive topics. The episodes address issues that touch upon the very essence of human existence and speak directly to the human mind in our present time. Comprehensive approach. This is a global debate that excludes no one, opening the doors of thought to every thoughtful seeker of truth on this planet.
Share your opinions with us. We hope you enjoy this engaging and intellectually stimulating program. We at the channel's management encourage anyone with a comment, viewpoint, or contribution to share it with us in the comments section. We are open to hearing your opinions and are fully prepared to discuss them politely, objectively, and with mutual respect. Be there, and we hope you enjoy the show.
The Muslim says, and how can human reason be trusted if?
The atheists comment. The rest doesn't matter. You have no choice. This is the only reason you have access to. However, I would propose that the fact that it works is sufficient as a guide to accepting it. The fact that we can reason about how to make a thing to do a job, then we make that thing and it does that job, is sufficient to justify relying on reason. But beyond that, human reason is not reliable, and we know this. How many times has our reasoning been wrong? Led to incorrect conclusions. Reason told us the earth was flat. That was wrong. Reason told us lightning was sent by Zeus. That was wrong. Reason told us continents couldn't move. That was wrong. This is why empiricism rose as the most robust method of determining the possible, setting the constraints of reality that we accept, because so often our conclusions based upon pure reasoning fails. Empiricism doesn't, because it's based on observation of how reality actually is, rather than how the meat computers in our skulls think it is. Then add that you trust calculators and computers every single day of your life. Yet, ultimately, they're just electromagnetic switches flipping back and forth, and nothing more. What something is, what it's made of, is irrelevant to whether it is trustworthy. It is the reliability of the output that determines such, not the nature of it.
The Muslim replies, this argument conflates 3 distinct levels: human error, the mechanism for correcting knowledge, and the very source of the mind's reliability. It is true that humans err, and it is true that some historical conclusions have been wrong, such as the flat earth theory or the mythological explanation of lightning. But this does not mean that the mind is unreliable, rather that the application of reason was limited, incomplete, or not supported by sufficient data. If the mind were inherently unreliable, we would never have been able to discover and correct these errors. The statement "we erred in the past, therefore the mind is unreliable" ignores a more important fact. The very act of admitting error is a result of using the same mind that is supposedly unreliable. The assertion that empiricism never fails is inaccurate because experimentation itself relies on reason to interpret results, connect them, and deduce laws from them. Experimentation does not speak for itself. It needs a logical and rational framework for understanding it. Otherwise, it becomes meaningless, silent data. Even trust in calculators and computers isn't based on them being merely electromagnetic switches, but rather on our understanding of the mathematical and logical laws upon which they are designed, and our verification of their operation first through reason and then through experimentation. Reliability here doesn't reside in the material itself, but in the consistency of the rational laws governing its operation. The assertion that empiricism doesn't fail ignores the fact that experimentation itself can be misinterpreted, imprecisely designed, and produce contradictory results. Distinguishing between correct and incorrect results is impossible without referring to independent rational and logical principles. Therefore, the issue isn't a choice between unreliable reason and absolute experience, but rather an integration of reason and experience, wherein either can function or be understood without the other. The Muslim says, matter is constantly changing, whereas mathematic and logical principles remain static.
The atheist's comment. Ways of describing things don't change. Consider the color, red. Red is an abstraction. So whether something is red or not can change, but the definition of red doesn't, and therefore the test to see if red applies to some object doesn't. This doesn't mean red exists in some way, it's just a description, nothing more. It has, in itself, no power to do anything.
The Muslim replies. This response conflates two distinct types of stability, the stability of the concept and the stability of the principle that governs reality. While it is true that the definition of red as a linguistic or mental term may remain fixed within a particular linguistic system, this does not render it a mere arbitrary description detached from reality. The concept of red itself is based on a specific physical property, a particular wavelength of light, meaning it refers to a structure in the external world, not simply a closed mental label. However, analogy with colors is not analogous to the case of logic and mathematics. Here, we are not discussing names or classifications, but rather organizational principles that govern every possible description. When you say that the definition of red does not change, you implicitly assume the existence of a linguistic and mental system that allows for stability, identity, and the applicability of the concept to cases. These assumptions themselves rely on logical principles that run deeper than language alone. Furthermore, the statement that symbols do not have an effect in themselves is true at the physical level, but it is entirely unrelated to the fundamental objection. The issue is not that numbers or concepts drive things, but rather that they reveal real relationships in reality, allowing for its prediction and control with astonishing precision. The fundamental difference here is that colors, as concepts, describe sensory properties that are subject to change and variation in perception. Logic and mathematics, on the other hand, are general conditions for any description, perception, or experience that is inherently possible, and cannot be reduced to mere fixed labels without falling into circular reasoning. Therefore, the analogy misses the point because the question is not about the stability of definitions, but about the foundation of the laws that make any definition or description possible in the first place. The Muslim says, abstract truths.
The atheist's comment. More abstract descriptions. They aren't true, they're just ways to describe things.
The Muslim replies. This response relies on reducing a complex philosophical question to a linguistic decision, as if saying abstract automatically means unreal. But the distinction between abstract description and reality is not so simple. There is a difference between something being immaterial and something being unreal. Numbers, logic, and mathematical facts are all immaterial, yet serious science and philosophy do not treat them as mere arbitrary linguistic descriptions. When we say that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, we are not describing a linguistic habit, but rather pointing to a necessary and constant relationship that does not change with people, language, or circumstances. This is not a label, but a logical construct that any thinking mind should arrive at. Furthermore, saying that they are mere descriptions does not explain why these descriptions succeed in describing the world with such astonishing accuracy. If they were merely linguistic inventions, the success of mathematics in physics and technology would be vague and unjustified. There is also a deeper problem with this argument, to say that everything is merely a description, you are using logical concepts to justify this judgment. That is, you presuppose the existence of valid rules of reasoning that distinguish between right and wrong and between consistent and contradictory. These rules themselves are not simply a description, but rather prerequisites for any possible description whatsoever. Therefore, the issue is not about reducing everything to language, but about understanding whether language itself is based on deeper truths that give it meaning and authority, or whether it operates in a baseless void. The Muslim says, "A student studies for a future they have never witnessed."
The atheists comment. They study for a future they see in others. No one studies flint knapping, for instance, interested in a future in fire starting. Why? Because they don't see futures in others that reflect this. And because the world can change, sometimes these studies can go awry. People study to become familiar with driving and operating a horse-drawn carriage, only for cars to come along and replace them. Before, there were no cars, so the futures they saw around them seemed secure when they chose their studies. But with the new advent of cars, their services went out of fashion and all that study was a waste. In more modern times, sometimes this can happen so fast that those who graduate do so with degrees and knowledge that is useless to them, since the few years of study saw a massive shift in the job market, and now said market is oversaturated, or the field is no longer viable for new entrants or similar. The future isn't real, it's a model we make, a guess. Or, rather, if it is real, which it may be, but in a purely physical way, we have no access to it in the present, and so what we have in our minds is a model, a guess.
The Muslim replies. This response conflates uncertainty in predicting the future with denying the very existence of meaning in the act of studying. It is true that the future is uncertain, and that the value of some disciplines may change with the changing job market or technology. However, this does not negate the fact that humans always act based on expectations about the future, whether accurate or inaccurate. Even your choice of action now, including the very act of arguing, is based on a mental model of the future. You expect that what you are doing will lead to some outcome, even something as simple as gaining a better understanding, persuading the other party, or improving your situation. Saying that the future is just a guess is true in terms of uncertainty, but it is inaccurate if understood as meaning that it has no reality or influence on our decisions. We do not reach the future, but we deal with its possibilities as a genuine part of rational thought. Otherwise, all human behavior would be entirely random. Furthermore, the example of stone tools and automobiles does not negate the idea of planning for the future. Rather, it confirms it. Humans develop their tools and knowledge because they expect the world to continue operating according to certain laws that allow for adaptation and learning. If the future were entirely separate from the present and could not be rationally modeled, science, education, and economic planning would be impossible. The statement that what we have is merely a model is partially true, but it does not mean that the model is worthless or without reference. Models in science, economics, and medicine are not empty guesses, but rather tools built upon real-world patterns that are constantly tested, refined, and used to make predictions with varying degrees of accuracy. Therefore, the problem lies not in the future being invisible, but in the conclusion that it is incapable of systematic mental processing. This conclusion is inconsistent with the fact that virtually all organized human action is based on expectations about the future, even if those expectations are probabilistic and uncertain. The Muslim says, belief in the unseen is not an exceptional phenomenon.
The atheists comment. Yes and no. Belief in the possibility of the unseen is not exceptional, but to accept that it is real is problematic. Moreover, to accept a possibility that is not formally perceived or reasonably extrapolated from what is seen is even worse. When computers really started to get going, Bill Gates knew what computers could do because he worked with them, building them himself. He could extrapolate from the patterns he'd seen in them where these were headed, and formed a company based upon that. Gods don't fit into this. We can extrapolate minds, but we have never observed a mind that was not connected to a physical object. To propose that one might be without observation is silly. It would be as if someone knew computers existed, and decided to open a company on the basis that there might exist a ghost computer that was better. Such a business would be nothing but promises that never came to be. Religion gets around this vaporware sales pitch by making all the most extravagant and desirable promises it offers locked behind death, where none can check to see if the offers are true or not.
The Muslim replies. This argument rests on an inaccurate equation between technical prediction within the realm of experience and explanatory questions about the origin of existence in mind. The computer example is unsuitable here for a simple reason. We infer the existence and development of computers within the same physical framework we observe and interact with daily, that is, within a world whose results can be tested and replicated. Therefore, the induction here is direct and limited in scope. However, discussions of mind, God, or the unseen are not of the same nature. They pertain to questions about the very foundation upon which the existence of computers, minds, and possible patterns is even comprehensible. In other words, it is a shift from examining the system itself to questioning the very reason for the system's existence. Furthermore, the statement, "We have not seen a mind unattached to a body, therefore its existence is absurd," is a conclusion that transcends empirical data. Empirical sciences do not prove the impossibility of what they have not observed. They merely state that we have not detected it within the scope of our experience. There is a difference between not observing and logical impossibility. Even in the example of minds, we don't see the mind as an independent substance, but rather infer it from its effects and behavior. Therefore, linking existence to mind and body is an explanatory model, not a direct sensory reality. As for the claim that belief in the unseen is unverifiable and therefore irrational, it presupposes a criterion for truth, confinement to what is directly observable empirically. This is itself a philosophical position, not a neutral scientific conclusion. Finally, linking belief in the unseen to unverifiable promises conflates two different types of claims, a claim that can be empirically tested over time, and a claim that addresses the origin of existence, meaning, and the limits of experience itself. The issue is not marketing an invisible product, but rather a disagreement about whether reality is confined to what can be measured in the first place. The Muslim says, such is the belief that the universe emerged from nothing.
The atheists comment. No one believes this. Not even atheists. Not even Lawrence Krauss, who wrote a book titled A Universe from Nothing. This is another straw man fallacy.
The Muslim replies, it is true that the phrase, the universe arose from nothing, is sometimes used in a simplistic or imprecise manner in public discourse, but the philosophical objection rests not so much on a specific popular formulation as on a deeper idea, explaining the origin of the universe without postulating a transcendent cause. Even when the word nothingness is replaced with terms like quantum state, physical vacuum, or primary physical laws, the question remains, are these states truly nothingness, or are they forms of physical existence with their own laws and structure? Therefore, the debate does not stop at the literal quotation of the phrase from nothingness, but rather at whether the natural model explains the origin of the laws themselves or presupposes them. Referencing Lawrence Krauss or others, at best, illustrates that the terms are used in different ways, but it does not resolve the philosophical question about the meaning of nothingness and the possibility of the universe arising from it. Therefore, the objection is not to the opinion that the universe came from nothing as a literal sentence, but to a set of explanatory models that attempt to rely solely on physics to explain the origin of reality, without determining whether this physics itself is based on something deeper or not. The Muslim says that life arose without a creator.
The atheists comment. Unless you have expertise in chemistry, it looks like it did. Scientists don't declare it yet because there's more to work out, but we already know so much about it. In fact, one of the big issue is less how it might have, but more which one actually works. We have too many possibilities right now. But every year brings us a little closer to showing the chemistry that led to the first life. And, of course, showing that the first life isn't even really a definable point, because there's almost no difference between that first life and its predecessor which wasn't alive. Instead, it was almost certainly a slow becoming, with a lot in between where it's not clear if it was alive or not. Sort of like speciation via evolution.
The Muslim replies, this statement describes an important aspect of scientific research into the origin of life, but it doesn't address the philosophical objection raised by the original text. The fact that scientists are studying possible chemical stages of life's emergence, or that multiple scenarios are being examined, doesn't mean that the question, where did life come from, has been solved or resolved. It simply means we have partial models of how chemical complexity evolved within the framework of life, not a definitive explanation for the emergence of life itself. The assertion that there is no sharp difference between living and non-living is a claim made in evolutionary biology and biochemistry, but it doesn't settle the philosophical question of the transition from an unconscious system to a living system capable of metabolism, self-replication, and directed interaction. In other words, talking about a series of stages doesn't negate the need to explain the nature of the series itself, nor how its initial conditions arose. Furthermore, the abundance of scientific hypotheses does not imply that the matter is settled. Rather, it reflects the fact that the field remains open, and that we still lack a definitive, universally agreed-upon model for the origin of life from entirely non-living matter. Therefore, the objection is not to scientific research itself, but to the leap from the existence of possible scenarios under study to the absence of any philosophical problem or deeper explanation. This transition is logically unjustified. The Muslim says, or that human consciousness emerged spontaneously from lifeless matter.
The atheists comment. Your brain is made of lifeless matter. If we affect your brain, we affect your consciousness. We can change the way you feel and even the way you think. So human consciousness emerges from lifeless matter. That humans evolved has also been demonstrated via examinations and predictions in empirical science.
The Muslim replies, here you are confusing correction with explanation. The fact that the brain influences consciousness, or that changes in brain chemistry alter feelings and thoughts, does not necessarily mean that consciousness has been fully explained as merely matter. When a radio breaks down and the sound becomes distorted, this proves a connection between the device and the sound, but it does not prove that music itself is simply electronic circuitry. Similarly, the relationship between the brain and consciousness does not resolve the deeper philosophical question: how does conscious subjective experience arise from inert, material interactions? We are not simply talking about information processing, but about internal sensation itself. How do you feel pain? How do you perceive the color red? How can self-awareness and internal experience even exist? This is what is known in philosophy as the difficult problem of consciousness, and it remains unresolved and unexplained. Invoking evolution does not solve the problem either, because proving the evolution of living organisms is not the same as explaining how consciousness arises from matter. Evolution describes the change in biological structures over time, but alone does not answer the question, why does conscious experience exist at all, rather than simply unconscious chemical processes? Furthermore, your assertion that the brain is inanimate matter is itself paradoxical, because you are assuming that matter is capable, of its own accord, of producing a mind capable of understanding logic, mathematics, truth, and meaning. This is not a straightforward empirical conclusion, but rather a philosophical position that requires a deeper explanation than simply pointing to brain activity. The Muslim says, cannot explain the existence of reason itself.
The atheists comment. Biology. The capacity to hold information and react to it is a survival advantage in some circumstances. Doing so better is more advantageous in other circumstances. Brain matter is required to do this, and the difference in brain mass as compared to body weight between a chimpanzee and a human is a single-point mutation. From their selection favors the improved use of it, to a point. That's where it comes from.
The Muslim replies, this explanation clarifies how cognitive abilities can give an organism a survival advantage, but doesn't explain the nature of the mind and consciousness itself. Natural selection might explain why certain neural structures are advantageous, but doesn't answer the deeper question, how does conscious subjective experience arise from physical activity? How do electrical and chemical signals transform into an understanding of meaning, a feeling of pain, self-awareness, or an understanding of mathematics and logic? There's a significant difference between explaining the evolution of intelligent behavior as an adaptive advantage, and explaining consciousness itself as a genuine internal experience. Furthermore, an increase in brain size or a change in its structure doesn't automatically explain the emergence of a conscious mind, just as an increase in the number of transistors in a computer doesn't explain the emergence of a subjective experience that the computer can perceive. Most importantly, if the mind is merely an evolutionary tool for survival, why should we trust that it's capable of grasping abstract truth in the first place? Natural selection favors what helps in survival and reproduction, not what guarantees access to philosophical or logical truth. However, we treat the mind as a tool capable of discovering universal mathematical and logical laws, not merely a biological survival mechanism. Therefore, the issue was not denying the existence of a biological explanation for brain evolution, but rather pointing out that this explanation alone does not resolve the questions of consciousness, mind, meaning, and abstract perception, issues that remain philosophically and scientifically relevant to this day. The Muslim says, cannot explain why the laws of the universe are orderly and consistent.
The atheists comment. That's what defines them as laws. Law is a description. Things which are orderly and consistent have laws humans invent in their minds to describe them, and the term law is applied to them in that context. Thus, what is not orderly and consistent isn't a law, and what is orderly and consistent is a law. You've got the causality backwards.
The Muslim replies, here you are explaining the meaning of the word law, but you're not answering the original question. Why is reality itself ordered and describable by these laws in the first place? It is true that humans formulate laws as descriptive models, but these models do not succeed in a vacuum. When we formulate a physical law, we are not inventing the order of nature, but rather discovering a prior order independent of us. Otherwise, experiments could not be repeated, nor could predictions succeed. So the question is not, why do humans call patterns laws, but rather, why do fixed and orderly patterns exist instead of absolute chaos? Furthermore, saying that what is ordered and consistent we call a law does not explain the reason for this consistency itself, but merely redefines it in different terms. This is like someone asking, why does water quench thirst? The answer is because we call things that quench thirst water. Here, nothing is explained. The phenomenon is simply redefined in words. As for the question of causality, the issue is not that the law causes reality, but rather that the existence of detectable mathematical and logical regularities raises a legitimate philosophical question about the nature of the universe itself and why the mind can understand it with such precision. Scientific laws are not merely names, but expressions of real constants and relationships in reality. Otherwise, technology and science would not be able to operate with such accuracy and repetition. The Muslim says, assumptions for which no material proof exists.
The atheists comment. I'd like you to name one. Everything we think about order and logic and math all derives from experience of reality. The law of non-contradiction, for instance, is observable every day, in that we do not observe a thing that is what it is and is what it isn't.
The Muslim replies, the example you're asking for is in your own words, the law of non-contradiction. You say we derive it from observing reality, but the problem is that any observation of reality presupposes the validity of this law. When you observe that something cannot be itself and its opposite at the same time, you are using the principle of non-contradiction to explain the observation itself. That is, the law is not merely a result of experience, but a prerequisite for understanding experience. Therefore, there is a difference between observing examples that conform to the law, and basing the validity of the law itself on observation. Because any experiment can be wrong or misinterpreted, you cannot even describe the error without assuming that the contradiction is logically unacceptable. Furthermore, logical laws are not treated as empirical laws subject to modification like scientific theories. If a strange phenomenon appears in physics, we don't say, then the contradiction is true, but rather we try to reinterpret the phenomenon within a consistent logical framework. This shows that logic is deeper than mere empirical generalization. The same applies to mathematics. We don't conduct millions of experiments to prove every time that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. Rather, we consider it a necessary truth prior to experimentation, and we use it to understand the world, not merely to derive it from it. Therefore, the issue is not denying that the mind interacts with reality, but rather objecting to reducing logic and mathematics to mere mental habits derived from the senses, even though the senses themselves cannot be explained or organized without these a priori principles.